This message comes from Sony Pictures Classics with the new romantic comedy, Jane Austen Wrecked My Life. A woman dreams of becoming a successful writer and experiencing true love while at a Jane Austen writer's residency. Now playing only in theaters.
Hello, hello. I'm Brittany Luce, and you're listening to It's Been a Minute from NPR, a show about what's going on in culture and why it doesn't happen by accident. This week, we're connecting the dots between incels, Dave Chappelle, and Obergefell. I know. How are all these things connected? Well, we're going to find out with culture journalist and co-host of the podcast Black Queer Canon, Tre'vell Anderson, and author, movement organizer, and one of Time's 2025 Women of the Year, Raquel Willis.
Thank you for having us.
Welcome back to It's Been a Minute.
Back by popular demand.
Okay, all right. Okay, so it's officially Pride Month. Do you have any advice for surviving one's first Pride Month, aside from hydrate?
Hydrate is a good one.
That was the first one. Hydrate, sunscreen, honey.
You don't have to go to everything. It's okay.
If you're wearing glitter makeup, watch out, honey, for them eyes. Protect those eyes.
You will find it in places you did not put it weeks and weeks and weeks later. All right, well, Pride Month is upon us yet again. And this one marks 10 years since the Supreme Court made its ruling on Obergefell versus Hodges, legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. But the fight for marriage equality often overshadowed other very real concerns of the queer community, including rights to housing, healthcare, and being able to move freely without being subject to police harassment. And now we're seeing a barrage of legislative efforts targeting the queer community, from bans on books about LGBTQ history to attempts to eliminate Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care. A lot of this legislation curbs the rights of transgender Americans. And there are some signs that the cultural tide may be turning on Pride. From San Francisco and New York City to World Pride this week in D.C., which you are at right now, Raquel, these cities have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in sponsorships and partnerships. Local LGBTQ centers across the country are facing challenges trying to meet funding gaps. These material threats to the daily lives of many LGBTQ Americans have some folks wondering if the movement left behind some of the very people who birthed it. So I wonder, how are you and your homegirls doing Pride this year?
Yeah, I mean, this Pride is a bit grittier for me than past ones. With my organization, Gender Liberation Movement, we actually had an amazing punk rock festival. So that kind of kicked it off for us. And then later this week, we're doing some discussions around safety in this time and how, as a movement, particularly as trans leaders, we can protect each other.
What about you, Tre'vell? How is Pride feeling to you in 2025 versus Pride in years past?
Yeah, well, me and my girlies did make our way to West Hollywood Pride this past weekend, the kickoff, if you will. But I feel like we did it reluctantly, if I'm being honest. Okay, There's just a lot going on, Brittany. And I think particularly as Black, queer, and trans folks, right, we recognize what our community is going through. And so while, yes, we want to dance in the glitter and do a little bit of the oonce, we also recognize a little bit of what Raquel said, that the stakes are different this year. And so also trying to figure out ways to be intentional about our time and our efforts this month.
Let's take a look back for a second. I mean, Pride has become a phenomenon, but it didn't start off that way. I read that the first documented Pride March in San Francisco had about 30 people marching, and compare that to New York Pride last year with an estimated 2.5 million people participating. And over those years, Pride has meant so many different things, from protest to celebration. But it's also garnered some critical responses from members of the LGBTQ community who have felt like Pride has become more of an economic opportunity for some parts of the community at the expense of others. I wonder, what does Pride mean this year?
I think Pride means the same thing this year as it's meant in past years to many folks on the margins. I mean, it's about remembering that radical history. And we talk about the Stonewall riots. We throw out names like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. But I don't think enough people really tap into their value system. And so this kind of idea that we can just party and ignore the very real dangers that trans people still face in our community, but also within our society, is a problem. And it does a disservice to that radical history.
Trayvell, I see you nodding along.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm Black. Maybe it's because I'm trans. But I feel like this year, when we're seeing the attempts to restrict and ban healthcare for trans folks, when we're seeing, what's happening to our undocumented family, I think Pride is a chance for us as a community to come together in spite of all of that as well.
In addition to both of your sort of personal individual definitions of what pride means, pride has also become, honestly, a branding or marketing opportunity for corporations. I think back to the first Pride that I went to was New York Pride in 2007, 2008. I went with my sister and my now sister-in-law. And I remember even then being like, oh, there's a lot of like companies here, and like the police department is here and walking in the parade. Thinking about corporate pride, what do you make of this massive corporate funding pullout from pride events across the country this year, especially in light of the critiques that pride has become too corporate?
I think it shows that the commitment to the community was never real for most of these companies, right? They were never really invested in ensuring and in protecting LGBTQ plus folks. They saw it as a tax break. They saw it as, a chance to ingratiate themselves with at least a segment of our community that is, upwardly mobile and does have the, expendable income to pad their bottom lines. But when it's come to at least a pivotal moment like the one we are in, we don't see these corporate entities pushing back against the Trump administration. We don't see these corporate entities making sure that their health insurance programs cover gender-affirming care regardless of the state that their employees live in, right? I think those are ways that the corporate commitment to pride into our community can be long-term.
Yeah, I feel like as soon as Trump said at the inauguration that we were going to move to a society that was truly about meritocracy, all of these corporations were like, okay, finally, bump the Black and brown folks, bump the queer and trans folk, bump women, writ large.
I mean, and even though there was not a federal mandate saying that private companies had to eliminate their DEI programming, there were more than a few major corporations that opted to do exactly that. To your point, I imagine that there are some people out there who may be listening and thinking, okay, once gay marriage was decided, that there'd be enough momentum that we wouldn't be seeing the kind of rollback that we've seen for LGBTQ rights. Is there a moment that you all think back to and think, oh yeah, this is a moment that kind of foretold what we're seeing now?
I personally think back to kind of the ongoing discourse around Dave Chappelle and, his anti-trans quote unquote jokes, right? And the ways that discourse has pitted Black communities against trans communities, in the process erasing those of us who are both Black and trans, right?
I mean, it's interesting, the question of the last 10 years, because I feel like there were signals of what was possible in terms of a backlash even before that. And that is kind of rooted in a history within gay political lobbying in the U.S., where some of those standard bearers were like, we're not going to risk our fight on these freaks, essentially. And the freaks were the trans folks and the drag queens. And I'm really nodding to actually Steve and Dean, who is considered essentially like a father of gay political lobbying, who was foundational in the creation of the Human Rights Campaign. But he wrote a book kind of talking about this fight to be a part of the mainstream and kind of his idea that, again, we didn't want to have trans people mucking up this fight. These fissures were already there. And I think because we didn't do enough reckoning and healing along the way, the right kind of came in and took advantage of those fissures and connected that to a broader ignorance around who trans and non-binary people are.
Coming up.
They see us out in the street, dipping it and doing it, living our lives, and folks are unsettled within themselves because they have not yet embraced that freedom.
Stay with us.
This message comes from Sattva. Everyone has a unique skill or ability. It just needs to be discovered, then nurtured. One way to foster that is getting quality sleep, which can improve athletic abilities, increase energy, and boost memory and learning. Every Sattva mattress is designed to promote that kind of sleep. In fact, Sattva was named Best Luxury Mattress by SleepFoundation.org. And now, save $200 on $1,000 or more at sattva.com/NPR. Support for this podcast and the following message come from Made in Cookware. President and co-founder Jake Kalick shares a tool that's useful for both master and newbie griller.
The craftsmanship of the carbon steel griddle enhances your grilling experience because it allows you a totally different type of grill surface that opens up the amounts of food you're able to cook. So the griddle is the perfect accessory to add to your grill and kind of widen your grilling game.
Learn more about Made in Cookware at MADEIN This message comes from Charles Schwab. When it comes to managing your wealth, Schwab gives you more choices, like full-service wealth management and advice when you need it. You can also invest on your own and trade on Thinkorswim. Visit schwab.com to learn more. Support for this podcast comes from Dignity Memorial. For many families, remembering loved ones means honoring the details that made them unique. Dignity Memorial is dedicated to professionalism and compassion in every detail of a life celebration. Find a provider near you at dignitymemorial.com.
So I want to dig into this a little bit more. I mean, this is something that also kind of comes up to a certain degree in data. A Pew Research survey that came out last week really struck me. It said 51% of cisgender gay and lesbian adults say they have much in common with bisexual and straight people, but only 28% say they have a lot in common with transgender people. This feels connected to a lot of what you've just brought up, Raquel, and also feels connected to the perception that the Democratic Party went too far in centering trans rights during Biden's administration, which some people thought led to the reelection of Donald Trump. What do you make of that?
I think it's revisionist history. Let's be clear, Kamala Harris and Biden didn't really talk about trans folks that much over the course of their time in power. I mean, you could probably point to a handful of times in major addresses where they mentioned the existence of trans folks. I really want cis, gay, lesbian, bi, queer folks to understand that you have so much more in common with trans and non-binary people than you realize. When I think about what homophobia looks like when it happens in everyday life, it generally is because of a gender thing, because you're not performing your gender or moving in your gender identity in a way that people see as normative, which is something that is connected to the experiences that trans and non-binary people have.
You know, some of the things we're discussing right now remind me of like a broader gender panic that we're seeing across culture right now, from the rise of incels to the trad wife phenomenon. And that is a panic that also, you know, is specifically leaving a lot of queer and trans and non-binary people on edge. What do you make of this kind of gender panic that we are seeing across our culture right now?
I think about the connections between what we saw in the fall of Roe v. Wade, right? And we saw this Dobbs decision come down. There are all these ways that people's reproductive capabilities are being controlled, or at least the state is saying we want to control those now. That is part and parcel with whether trans youth can have access to gender-affirming care. Again, it's another discussion about whether the state can intervene on private decisions that people are making about their own bodies, about their kids' bodies, with their physicians. So I think it's important for us to understand that we have to continue to push back against all of these notions of state control. Really, these fights are deeply connected to all of our right to bodily autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is an attempt to restrict and constrict and, contain the pride, the freedom that we as queer and trans people exhibit. They see us out in the street, dipping it and doing it, living our lives, and folks are unsettled within themselves because they have not yet embraced that freedom. And I think we as queer and trans people say, actually, I'm going to make my own decisions. I'm going to carve out the life that I want. And I think so many of the powers that be see that and they recognize the power in that. And now they're attempting to mobilize all of these other communities that could be threatened by that because they recognize that deeply unsettles these white supremacist foundations that keep us all bound.
On that note, I mean, Pride Month is only 1 month out of the year. What are your hopes for the queer community going into the rest of the summer and beyond?
My hope is that we are taking this moment to appropriately fortify ourselves for what will be a continued fight ahead. I hope that we are taking the lessons from our elders and using that, right, for how we move through this particular moment that we're navigating.
It's hard right now, but no one can tell me it's harder than it's ever been. And I think about so many, particularly Black, queer, and trans elders and what they built despite so many forces against them. Thank you, Crystal LaBeija, for building out the house and ballroom system. Think about Marsha and what she inserted into the culture ahead of time, right? And now we are feasting off of what she left us, right? As queer and trans folks, we get to name and claim ourselves because of people like her, because of Sylvia Rivera. They gave us blueprints for organizing, and we have to go back and pick up the rest of those seeds that they dropped along the way. We can't let them be forgotten. So I ain't got to tell you to party because, queer and trans people gonna party regardless. But party with a purpose, honey.
Okay.
Well, oh my gosh, party with a purpose. What a beautiful sentiment this month and every month. Raquel, Tre'vell, I have learned so much here. It's always so wonderful to have y'all on this show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you so much.
That was journalist Tre'vell Anderson and activist and author Raquel Willis. Tre'vell hosts the podcast Black Queer Canon, and Raquel hosts the Afterlives podcast, and season 2 is out now. And I'm going to put on my influencer hat for a second and ask you to please subscribe to this show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening. Click follow so you know the latest in culture while it's still hot. This episode of It's Been a Minute was produced by
Corey Antonio Rose.
This episode was edited by
Nina Patak.
Our supervising producer is
Barton Girdwood.
Our executive producer is
Verilyn Williams.
Our VP of programming is
Yolanda Sanguini.
All right, that's all for this episode of It's Been a Minute from NPR. I'm Brittany Luce. Talk soon.
This message comes from Jackson. Let's face it, retirement planning can be confusing. At Jackson, we're working to make retirement clear for everyone, starting with you. Our easy-to-understand resources and user-friendly digital tools help simplify your entire experience. You can have confidence in your retirement with clarity from Jackson. Seek the clarity you deserve at Jackson.com. Jackson is short for Jackson Financial Incorporated, Jackson National Life Insurance Company, Lansing, Michigan, and Jackson National Life Insurance Company of New York, Purchase, New York.
This message comes from LinkedIn Ads. One of the hardest parts about B2B marketing is reaching the right audience. That's why you need LinkedIn Ads. You can target your buyers by job title, company, role, seniority, and skills. All the professionals you need to reach in one place. To get a $100 credit on your next campaign so you can try it yourself, just go to linkedin.com/results. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. Only on LinkedIn Ads.